Footsteps echoed slowly across the carpeted floor, blending with the soft whistle of wind slipping through the metal frame of the aircraft parked at Gate 9. A man in a plain fleece jacket, faded jeans, worn sneakers, and a baseball cap pulled low to cover most of his face boarded the plane like any other ordinary passenger. No one turned to look. No one noticed. No one knew he was Michael, the legendary CEO of SkyReach Airlines, the man behind the transformation of the entire domestic aviation industry. But today, Michael wasn't sitting in an office with glass walls overlooking the runway. Today, he wasn't a CEO. Today, he was an anonymous traveler, silently stepping into a journey called Undercover Boss, a flight that seemed ordinary, until the door closed and Michael realized something was waiting behind him, a conspiracy, a confrontation, a moral crossroads between destruction and dialogue. And it all began with a single casual sentence from the two passengers seated just behind him. The sound of the airplane engine echoed across the metal floor as the automatic staircase came to a stop at the aircraft door. Cold wind from the runway rushed into the cabin, carrying a faint scent of jet fuel mixed with the disinfectant sprayed earlier that morning. A man stepped in, tall, slightly hunched, with a worn-out colored backpack slung over one shoulder and a simple carry-on bag in hand. He wore faded jeans, a low-collar zip-up jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low to the brim of his eyes. His gaze briefly swept toward the flight attendant greeting passengers at the front of the cabin, but that look was quickly obscured by the shadow of his cap. None of the passengers or attendants knew that the man was Michael, CEO and founder of SkyReach Airlines, a man who had spent over 20 years building the airline from a small local brand into one of the top 5 names in the domestic aviation industry. His image had appeared on the covers of Forbes, Wall Street Review, and in numerous articles about visionary leaders. But today, he was not here as a powerful CEO, but as a regular passenger on a domestic flight between two major cities. Michael did not choose a first-class seat as usual. Instead, he moved deeper into the economy cabin to row 18, a seat near the middle of the aircraft aisle side. As he passed the rows of seats, he quietly observed small details. Whether the seat covers were torn, if there were any stains on the armrests, how the flight attendants guided passengers with their luggage. He noticed a young flight attendant trying to maintain a steady smile while reminding an elderly man about his carry-on size. And he made a mental note. This girl handled the situation well, her voice soft but firm in enforcing the rules. He placed his bag in the overhead bin, pausing slightly when he noticed the hinge was a bit loose. His hand ran gently along it, the slackness causing a frown to form. A small detail, but one that could affect a passenger's sense of security. Michael made a mental note to add it to next week's maintenance list. He sat down, feeling the seat cushion had slightly flattened, one side of the seat lower than the other, creating a slight tilt. The armrest had a small scratch, the plastic peeling off, exposing a tiny piece of metal. Michael was not surprised. This happened with hundreds of flights daily, but he never allowed himself to grow accustomed to such deterioration. These small details were what made an airline stand out. He let his body sink into the seat, exhaling deeply. The engine sounds beneath the fuselage began to hum more steadily, signaling that takeoff was approaching. Another flight attendant passed by, checking if the overhead bins had been properly closed. Michael nodded politely. The woman offered a courteous smile, not recognizing who he was. As he began to unfold the magazine from the seat pocket in front of him, 2 passengers entered the row behind him. One was an older man with a shaved head, wearing a black leather jacket with its shine worn out, and the other was younger with bleached platinum hair, carrying a thin fabric backpack and wearing a headphone in one ear. The sound of zippers clinking, a water bottle hitting the floor softly, then being picked up, accompanied by a sigh. Michael didn't pay much attention. He was used to the usual clamor of the cabin, but a quiet comment from behind made him suddenly sit upright. "No one here pays attention to who we are in these seats," the older man said, his voice hoarse and low, full of confidence. "Just don't sit up there and we're fine. Only the rich get checked. Back here, it's all nobodies. Easy breathing." Michael didn't react immediately. He'd heard enough disdainful behavior on flights to know when someone was just boasting and when they were being serious. But what chilled him was the tone. It wasn't a careless comment. It was a statement, deliberate and calculated. The younger man replied with a worried voice, "So it'll be okay, right? I'm still kind of nervous. I mean, what if someone notices?" The older man chuckled softly. "Worry about what? Everything's arranged. We're just two passengers like anyone else. Get there, do the pull out. Quick and clean. When I say stop, you stop." Michael felt his chest tighten. He still wasn't sure what they were talking about. But if his instincts were right, this wasn't just a casual conversation. A cautious feeling surged in him, the kind forged from years of high-stakes corporate negotiations, lawsuits, even threats when the airline started expanding. He quietly pulled a safety card from the seat pocket and pretended to read, while his ears stayed alert to every syllable. The man behind continued, his voice now lower. "I don't want all the details, but are you sure we're not doing anything dangerous?" "No bombs, nothing crazy," the other man replied, a hint of scorn in his voice. "Who do you think I am? We're not terrorists. We just need to get their attention, and they will pay attention." Michael closed his eyes as if dozing, but in truth he was mapping out the whole conversation. The two passengers behind him were involved in some kind of plan. They were hiding their intentions, and their target, he was almost certain, was SkyReach Airlines. Possibly the headquarters. Possibly a weak point in the system. Or worse, possibly a message meant for him personally. A thought flashed through his mind, sending a chill down his spine. Did they know he was sitting here? He opened his eyes, looking at the flight attendant now announcing the safety instructions. Her voice echoed steadily in the cabin, but no one was really listening anymore. In his head, another voice rose, the voice of instinct, of responsibility, and of warning. The plane began to taxi. The flight officially began. Michael fastened his seatbelt, tightening the strap of his laptop bag under his feet. The trip, he thought, was just for inspecting seat comfort and staff attitude. Might now be the key to preventing something far worse. If his instincts were right, he had to act. But first, he needed to understand more. He had to listen longer and be extremely careful. He leaned his head back, ears tuned, while his mind spun with unanswered possibilities. The flight had just begun, and he knew it would be anything but ordinary. The plane gradually lifted off the ground, its wheels retracting into the fuselage with a soft hiss beneath the floor. The force pressed Michael back into his seat, and for a few seconds the entire cabin fell silent, save for the steady rumble of the engines. He sat still, eyes half closed as if napping, but in truth every nerve was taut with tension. The vague dialogue from behind still echoed in his mind, as if someone were pressing each syllable into his brain. As soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began to stir. A few stood to retrieve books from the overhead bins. A couple made their way to the lavatory. A 3-year-old in a distant row giggled as his father played a game with him. Michael remained seated. He didn't want to draw attention, but he did want a real look at the two men behind him. He slowly unfastened his seatbelt, stood up, subtly pulling his sleeve down to cover the watch on his wrist that might give away his status. He stepped into the aisle, turning his head as if searching for the restroom. Taking that moment, he glanced quickly back. The older man remained calm, flipping through a fairly thick folder. The cover was plain, no logos or labels, but his expression was far too focused for it to be simple travel documents. The younger man beside him had his head in his hands, fingers tapping the fold-down tray, eyes flickering with unease. Michael made his way to the back of the plane, pretending to enter the lavatory, closing the door behind him and standing straight before the small mirror. He looked into the reflection, a middle-aged man, alert eyes, but with an appearance so nondescript that no one gave him a second glance. He thought about how he had built a vast system from scratch. How many times had he stood behind the scenes, letting others give the speeches at launches and awards? Not out of modesty, but because he believed the most important things happened backstage, not on the stage. Now that invisibility was his advantage. No one suspected who he was. No one recognized his voice. No one connected this man to the image of CEO Michael in the media. He adjusted his cap, opened the door, and walked back, once again passing the row where the two men sat. The older man, William, glanced up for a second, just enough for his eyes to meet Michael's. But the look quickly retreated, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. Michael noted that expression, no fear, no surprise. Perhaps he was used to hiding his true intentions beneath a calm facade. As Michael returned to his seat, the plane began to shake slightly. A message from the captain came over the speakers, asking passengers to return to their seats and fasten seatbelts due to upcoming turbulence. Michael sat down, buckled up, and then heard the rustle behind him. William spoke softly, his voice low but still audible to someone paying close attention nearby. Once we arrive, we act. No talk, no contact, no trace, you understand? The young man replied, his voice small and trembling. Yes, but what about the file? Are you sure? I'm afraid someone might see it. William responded immediately. If someone sees it, we're not good enough. Focus. Stick to the plan. They don't know anything. We're not the loud idiots out there screaming in the streets. We act. Quietly, precisely. Michael felt sweat bead in the palms of his hands. They had a plan, evidence, and a clear target. He still wasn't sure whether their intent posed a danger to the flight itself, but every sign pointed to action immediately after landing. It could be the headquarters, it could be a critical facility, or worse, a disguised protest turned violent. The flight attendants began pushing the drink cart. Michael raised a hand, requested a can of ginger ale, and declined the packet of peanuts. The attendant smiled, but her face seemed a bit rushed. Michael made another mental note. The service was fine but lacked refinement on this flight. As the cart rolled past, he leaned back slightly, continuing to listen. But this time, William had lowered his voice even more, making it harder to hear. Occasionally, Michael caught scattered words like image building, handover, symbol, reputation. Each of those words struck his mind like nails being driven in. They weren't meaningless. They were connected, and they were pointing at him, Michael, the man the press called the new face of humanistic aviation, the man who had donated millions of dollars to scholarship programs in remote areas, the man who had spoken about fairness and diversity in hiring, the man now becoming a target of something called the Shadow Equity Front, an organization known for radical actions against companies they accused of pretending to be fair. Michael exhaled deeply, no longer trying to maintain composure. He had to do something. But what, at this moment? Call the crew? There was no evidence. A false alarm could throw the entire flight into chaos. Worse, if passengers caught wind of even a rumor, the airline could face a wave of uncontrollable backlash. No, he had to wait, listen more, and be ready to act the moment the plane landed. A chime sounded again from the cockpit, announcing that the flight had reached cruising altitude. Some passengers reached for laptops, others pulled blankets over themselves. Michael couldn't sleep. His mind was like a river in turbulent flood. Within it were suspicion, anxiety, and anger. Why were these people targeting him? Because he represented a large corporation? Because his charitable efforts weren't enough to convince them? Or because, in their eyes, anyone successful was secretly a criminal? Another slight shake passed through the aircraft. Michael gripped his drink, eyes forward, but ears waiting for any sound from behind. A phrase, a name, a detail that could turn instinct into certainty. And then he heard it. William's voice, deeper, clearer than before, as if challenging the world itself. They'll remember this flight forever, trust me. The words dropped like ink into clear water, clouding everything. Michael sat motionless, a moment of perfect stillness. Then he gently gripped the armrest as if bracing for something to come. He knew then he was no longer just inspecting customer service. He had just become the central figure in a story whose ending no one yet knew. Michael sat upright, his hand still holding the now cold can of ginger ale, eyes fixed on the row ahead, but his mind spinning in a storm of possibilities. From the moment William's voice softly rose behind him, he was no longer a disguised passenger. He was a man standing at the threshold of an undefined threat. Each whispered word from the two men behind him was like a curtain being drawn back, revealing a fragment of some larger scheme. The air in the cabin thickened with an invisible pressure. It made no sound, yet pressed against Michael's chest as if he were breathing in a sealed room without windows. A passenger across the aisle raised a hand to call a flight attendant. The young woman stepped forward, bowed slightly to listen, then quickly nodded and walked off. Michael watched the movement, memorizing every step, every glance, every voice. It was all data, clues to an equation yet unsolved. He was far too familiar with recognizing danger from the smallest signs. In his youth, he had once saved his company from a disastrous investment deal by detecting a slight tremor in an investor's voice during a meeting. Now, that skill returned, and he needed it more than ever. William continued speaking. His voice now dropped lower, stripped of its earlier mockery, and shifted to commands. Don't talk to anyone when we land. Move immediately. We only have 3 minutes. Don't look around. If you see anyone watching, go straight to point 2. The young man nodded, a sound barely escaping his throat like a silent vow. Yes, I remember. I've memorized the map. From gate B12, turn left, take the elevator to the basement level, exit to the rideshare pickup. The license plate has been sent in code. Michael shuddered. This was no longer the talk of two rebels angry over a social policy. These were the words of a plan laid out in detail with assigned roles, signals, codes. And worst of all, it had been prepared before they boarded. It was possible that even his current seat was accounted for in their calculations. He pretended to reach into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small notepad and a ballpoint pen. The back of the safety leaflet served as his writing surface. He wrote quickly, using lowercase letters. Seats 19B, 19's suspicious. Plot after landing. Encrypted movement. Private transport. Plate number possibly sent. Monitor discreetly. When the flight attendant returned to collect trash, he quietly slipped the note into the empty water bottle sleeve, placing it neatly on the tray in front of him. The young woman took it, and he whispered, I have some observations I'd like to share with the lead flight attendant. Please deliver this to her. Do not open it. She looked surprised for a moment, then gave a small nod. She didn't ask further, only gathered the trash and walked away. Michael watched her retreating figure, tension in his chest stretched like a taut string, waiting to see what reaction would follow. Just minutes later, the lead flight attendant, Mary, appeared from the forward cabin, walking slowly but decisively toward him. She was the only person on this flight who had ever met him during a private anniversary event for veteran employees. They had spoken for only a few short minutes, but he remembered her, and it seemed she recognized something as well. She stopped beside his seat, holding a folded piece of paper. She didn't open it, didn't ask anything, simply said quietly, How would you like me to proceed, sir? Michael looked up, his voice so low only the two of them could hear. Just observe. Don't raise the alarm. Keep them within control until we land. If anything unusual happens, signal with a white cloth. Mary nodded, her eyes sharp with the clarity of a seasoned officer. She turned and left without another word. Michael exhaled deeply. At least now he was no longer alone. Behind him, William's tone shifted again. Now he sounded like a lecturer. Do you know why I chose this airline? Not because the tickets are cheap, not because the schedule is convenient, but because this is the airline with a boss who hides behind a humanitarian mask, a man who plays the charity game to cover the face of an exploitative empire. The young man didn't reply. Perhaps even he no longer fully believed what he had been told. Maybe inside him a battle was brewing between justified anger and manipulated fanaticism. But William didn't allow time for doubt. He pressed on, voice heavier. We'll make him show his face. And when that happens, all his lies will collapse. Michael clenched the armrest. William had no idea he was sitting less than a meter away. No idea that every word was being heard. But that last sentence felt like a blade straight to Michael's heart. Show his face. That was what he had always avoided, not out of fear, but because he believed the work he didn't need to be showcased. And now that very anonymity had become the excuse for others to question his motives. The plane began to shake harder. A patch of turbulence rocked the cabin. The aircraft whined as if plunging into an invisible void. A few passengers gasped softly. Attendants hurried to remind everyone to fasten seatbelts. At that moment, William suddenly dropped the folder he had been holding on his lap. Papers scattered across the floor. The young man scrambled to gather them. "Don't let anyone see," William hissed, almost whispering, but full of command. Michael looked sideways through the gap between the seats. He couldn't make out the words, but he saw a page with a building layout, a few marked symbols, and something resembling a movement schedule. This was no longer suspicion. This was real. A plot was in motion, and he was at the center of it. The aircraft exited the turbulence. Calm returned to the air. But none of the three men, Michael, William, and the young man, felt normal anymore. Because now everything had shifted. What once seemed hidden was now slowly being exposed. And that was only the beginning. As the cabin lights shifted to a softer glow to prepare for the mid-flight phase, Michael still hadn't taken his eyes off the void ahead. Though his gaze was fixed on the open travel magazine on the tray table, his mind was methodically connecting the fragments of an unfolding scheme with no clear destination. William and the young man behind him had lowered their voices to the point of near inaudibility, but Michael could feel the atmosphere changing distinctly. Gone were the mocking or provocative tones. Now came the silence of calculation, the hush that only arrived when people were entering the critical stage of a plan. Michael remained still, but his mind was racing. He considered the viable options. Alerting the pilot was one, but if he was wrong, if all of this was just a misunderstanding, it would create a massive media backlash for the airline. Not because he feared damage to his personal image, but because the company had once faced a crisis after a passenger was barred from boarding due to ambiguous behavior. Since then, he had become extremely cautious about any action that could lead to baseless discrimination. But this time, he was convinced he wasn't wrong. William's words, the anxious expression of the young man, the building schematic in the folder, every detail was a red flag. Mary passed by his row, stopping for a moment beside him. No words, just a glance and a subtle nod, and she conveyed her message. The note had been received, reviewed, and they were monitoring the situation. Michael felt a sliver of reassurance. Having an ally in the cabin, especially someone as experienced as Mary, was invaluable. She had been with the airline for over 15 years, witnessing its transformation from a three-plane fleet to a giant with over 200 aircraft. Suddenly, a small sound came from behind. Not loud, but enough to make Michael tilt his head slightly. A soft click, like a latch being undone. Then the rustling of fabric. The young man was doing something with his backpack, followed by William's quiet voice. "Don't open it here. Wait for the signal." Michael felt his heart quicken. In his mind, possibilities branched out like an operations map. If they were carrying an electronic device, if they intended to interfere with cabin systems, if they carried something dangerous. He still had no physical evidence. He hadn't seen any device. But every sign pointed to action taking place as soon as the plane touched down. Michael quietly pressed the call button for the attendant. Not long after, Mary appeared. She bent down, pretending to check the seat back as if adjusting the recline. He spoke softly, voice barely a whisper. "They may be carrying a device. Must check thoroughly during disembarkation." Mary didn't react overtly. She nodded, then pulled a folded slip of paper from her chest pocket and handed it to him before stepping away. Michael opened the paper in his lap, pretending to clean his glasses. The neatly handwritten note read, "Ground security team has received the signal. Monitoring remotely. Need additional confirmation if any physical action occurs." Michael folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. He understood. They couldn't act based on words alone. They needed evidence or a specific action to intervene. Outside the window, the dim light of late afternoon began to appear. Pink-gray clouds drifted like silent phantoms. The plane started its gentle descent, with about 40 minutes left until landing. A passenger ahead stood to use the restroom. The young man behind also began to shift, pulling his backpack into his lap, checking the straps. William murmured, his voice like wind whistling through a crack. Don't do anything stupid. Remember, we're the signal, not the explosion. The young man nodded. I understand. I'll only bring it out when you say. Michael closed his eyes, head leaning back, but every cell in his body was tense. If the item in that backpack was a sabotage device, if it was a transmission signal, or even just a stolen internal document, everything could unravel quickly. He thought of the frontline staff he had met, stories of single mothers working through breaks to support their children's education, flight attendants silently helping elderly passengers with oxygen masks. All those things were why he continued steering this airline forward. And because of them, he couldn't let a scheme like this succeed. The captain's voice rang out over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please return to your seats, fasten your seatbelts, and ensure your tray tables are upright. Michael tightened his grip on the armrest. Another slight jolt passed through the cabin, as if the plane had just entered a pocket of turbulent air. There were no screams, but the atmosphere thickened. Not because of altitude, but because of anticipation. Readiness. Any small movement could be the signal that set things into motion. William suddenly turned to the young man. Lower the sunshade. Sit up straight. When we reach the runway, don't look at anyone. Keep your pace when leaving the plane. Don't stop for anything. Everything is arranged. The young man leaned forward and lowered the sunshade. Michael took the chance to glance sideways and caught his expression. A flicker of worry, a trace of panic, and then a look that was nearly despair. Michael knew the young man still had a sliver of conscience. He was not like William. He could still change, but now his choice would determine everything. He would either follow the order or turn back at the last moment. The plane shook once more before stabilizing at descent altitude. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated. The crew made their final checks of the cabin. Mary passed by, glanced at Michael. He didn't react, eyes closed as if resting. But his mind was overflowing, like water spilling over a dam. Every scenario was becoming clearer. The plane lands, the two men leave, get into the car, vanish. The plan is executed. His reputation tarnished. The airline systems compromised. Everything spirals out of control. Or he does something right now, as soon as the plane lands. If the opportunity presents itself, he won't let them escape. But to do that, he needs to wait a few more minutes and seize the exact moment, the moment when fate will be decided among three people on the same flight under the twilight glow of sunset. The plane began its descent. Thick clouds drifted past the window, and the city lights in the distance became blurry dots like ink bleeding through glass. The soft thud of the landing gear unfolding in the cargo hold echoed like a war drum, startling Michael even though he was prepared. The seatbelt was tightened around his waist, but his heart could no longer stay calm. Every minor movement, every sound behind him could be the signal for an irreversible act. William spoke quietly, but his voice was clearer now. No more disguises, no more euphemisms. Landing is the first move. Do you remember? When you exit the plane, don't look back. Just keep walking. Don't talk to anyone. Don't take anything from anyone, not even airport staff. The young man replied with a breathy tremor, I remember, but what if someone tries to stop us? William didn't answer immediately, a beat of silence. Then he responded in a low, cold voice, solid as stone. Then remember our purpose. We're not doing this for ourselves. This is for justice. Michael heard that word, and his whole body froze. Justice, a word so easily twisted by anger, so easily exploited to justify destruction. He knew William's kind well. They appointed themselves as judges, assigned guilt to others, and chose to destroy instead of engage. He had encountered protesters at conferences, extremist journalists, activists willing to splice data to create a sensational story. But William wasn't like them. William didn't crave attention. William wanted to strike at the foundation. The plane trembled as the wheels touched the runway. The screech of steel on steel rang out, then softened as the aircraft slowed, gliding across the tarmac like a tamed metal beast. Passengers stirred. Seatbelts clicked open. Some people stood even though the light had not gone off. Michael remained seated, eyes forward, his mind completely focused on the steps ahead. William and the young man began to shift behind him. There was the sound of zippers, backpacks being adjusted on shoulders, shoes brushing lightly against the carpet. The seatbelt light turned off. The announcement played, welcoming passengers to their destination. The cabin lights brightened again. The crowd began to flow. Michael stood up slowly, pulling his carry-on from the overhead bin, but his eyes never left the space behind him. He kept just enough distance, not too close to be suspicious, but close enough to observe. William stood 3 steps ahead, face turned away, gripping a folder tightly inside a gray document bag. The young man wore his backpack, eyes scanning the area quickly, like someone fearing pursuit. Mary appeared at the aircraft door, greeting each passenger with a steady tone, but her eyes scanned each person like a precision camera. When Michael passed, she said nothing more than, "Thank you." But her hand brushed against his sleeve, enough to signal that the security team was in position. Michael stepped into the jet bridge leading to the terminal. The air outside felt different, colder, laced with the smell of rubber and metal from the infrastructure. William and the young man moved quickly, walking at a steady pace, eyes forward. Michael followed 5 steps behind, maintaining distance, never taking his eyes off William's left shoulder. A young couple with a baby stroller blocked the walkway. Michael paused, pretending to step aside so he wouldn't overtake William. As the stream of passengers began to spread out into the baggage claim area, William changed direction, cutting across to a narrow corridor leading to a quieter section. Michael immediately recognized that this wasn't a standard route for regular passengers. He pretended to check his phone, slowed his steps, then followed. A young airport staff member pushing a luggage cart passed by. Michael used the moment to position himself behind the cart, blocking William's line of sight. As William and the young man entered a side corridor, Michael stopped at the entrance, observing. William glanced around, then pulled out his phone. The young man beside him unzipped his backpack and retrieved a small package wrapped tightly in black fabric. Michael couldn't see what was inside, but the way the young man handled it made clear. It was an object meant to activate or present something. A black car pulled up at the special pickup point. William opened his phone, said a few words, then nodded to the young man. The young man carried the package toward the car. Michael was about to follow when a female voice startled him from behind. "Sir, I think you should stop." It was Mary. When she had started trailing him, he didn't know. She gently tugged his sleeve, then pointed toward a nearby security camera. "We've got footage of William handing the item to the driver. Airport police are moving toward that vehicle now. There's no need to go further." Michael nodded, but his eyes never left the car. The door opened. The young man placed the package in the back seat. William stepped forward, but didn't get in. He said a few words, then stepped back. The car rolled forward. Mary took a photo of the license plate. A plainclothes security team began moving in from a distance. William glanced around, his gaze passing over Michael but not stopping. Perhaps he hadn't recognized him. Perhaps he had but wasn't sure. But in that moment, Michael saw that William's eyes held no fear, only calculation. The young man in the car lowered his head. The window rose. The car merged into the flow of vehicles outside. Michael tightened the strap of his bag. Everything had just begun. What he had witnessed wasn't merely a delivery, it was the first act in a planned sequence. And he, though not yet named, had already become the target. Mary took out her phone, reported to the security department. Her tone was calm, but her words were precise. Suspicious activity confirmed. Plate captured. Suspicious package placed in black car. ID code transmitted to headquarters. Michael stood still, watching the bustling crowd. The sky outside had turned deep indigo. The airport lights flickered like warning signals inside his head. He knew he had entered a different game now. No longer internal inspection, no longer service evaluation. This was real confrontation, and he had to be ready, because his opponent was not alone, and he wasn't finished. Next morning, the atmosphere at the SkyReach Airlines headquarters carried a strange heaviness, though no one said anything aloud. Employees in the lobby walked with a hint of haste, their eyes avoiding each other's gaze, as if trying to keep something from surfacing. Michael stepped through the large glass doors into the third-floor meeting room, where Alex, the head of the company's security division, was already waiting with the compiled data from tracking the two suspicious individuals from the day before. The room was soundproofed, the walls lined with framed photographs from the days when the airline operated with just a fleet of 4 aircraft. On the table, Alex laid down a thick dossier with a handwritten title in red, SF Activity, the acronym for Shadow Equity, Equity Front. Alex opened her laptop and projected clips onto the large screen, showing footage extracted from airport cameras. One clip showed William handing the package to the driver of a black car. Another showed the platinum-haired young man with his head bowed, gripping his backpack with trembling hands, as if trying to hold together a fragile world crumbling inside him. She said that SEF had a history of organizing protests disguised as public art displays, but with underlying acts of sabotage, dissemination of doctored information, or infiltrating company headquarters to access internal documents. They didn't use bombs or high-level violence, but always selected times and locations that would generate the greatest media damage. Michael stood before the screen, eyes fixed on the frame of William walking away from the airport with an utterly expressionless face. He exhaled softly, then spoke in a calm, deep tone. So this means they're targeting the image, the symbolic value of the company, not necessarily its physical assets. Alex nodded. Exactly. And they've chosen you as the central target because you're the face of the airline's social justice campaigns. To them, you're a suspicious figure, a man standing between profit and morality, and they want to expose any weakness to destroy that image. Michael sat down, his fingers interlocked. He was silent for a long moment before asking, "The car that carried the two of them, have we identified it?" Alex replied, "It was a prepaid rental with forged documents and a legitimate license plate attached temporarily. The police contacted the rental agency, but the listed name doesn't exist in any national ID database. So far, it's a dead end. However, our surveillance team traced a potential lead, a rundown warehouse near the Western Industrial Zone, previously registered by a defunct charity organization, which has had frequent activity in the last 2 days, including visits by William and the young man." Michael looked up. "What role are they playing there?" Alex answered, "We don't have a search warrant yet, but we've placed surveillance. We've seen materials being brought in, tarps, frame structures, paint buckets, projection equipment. We suspect they're preparing for a public protest action." Michael remained silent, eyes fixed on the wall where photos of the company's earliest employees hung. He remembered the scholarship ceremony held in the suburbs last year, where he shook hands with underprivileged students whose eyes sparkled with hope. Now all of that could be distorted by a single press of a record button. He asked, "When will they strike?" Alex speculated. "Likely within the next 3 days. We have intel that they're circulating internal invitations among activist circles, calling them to an event titled The Truth About SkyReach, location unspecified but likely here at headquarters." Michael nodded. "If they pick this building, we need to increase security, but do it quietly. No barricades. We can't let them twist it into a narrative of oppression. I want our response to be transparent, not defensive." Alex jotted notes and asked, "Do you want to hold a press conference ahead of time to get ahead of the narrative?" Michael paused, then said, "Not yet. Let them come forward first. Then we respond. With data, facts, and dialogue. I'm not afraid of them, and I won't hide." The meeting ended in silence. Michael returned to his 8th-floor office, where the afternoon light streamed through the large glass wall and illuminated his old oak desk. He sat down, opened his laptop, and pulled up records from the scholarship and recruitment programs that had previously faced allegations of discrimination. Numbers scrolled across the screen, but what caught his eye wasn't the amount spent. It was the unusually high rejection rates from certain residential zip codes. He called the HR department, requesting all rejection reasons from the past 2 years. He wanted to know if there were flaws in the system he had trusted so completely. Before leaving the office, Michael received a message from Alex. A digital flyer was spreading on private forums. SkyReach Airlines, a false dream, See you Wednesday, right at the center of power. He stared at the blood-red text printed over an image of the company's headquarters. William didn't just want to protest, he wanted to expose him in front of a crowd. That night, Michael came home late. In the kitchen, his wife Evelyn was making tea. She didn't ask many questions, just looked at him with seasoned eyes. He sat down, hands folded. She said, "I saw the message from security. You should be careful." He nodded. "I'll handle it. But you know I can't keep hiding. They might be wrong, but if even part of it is right, we have to listen." Evelyn said nothing more, simply placed the cup of tea in front of him. Michael took a sip, then said, "I heard them talking behind me on my own flight. They didn't know who I was, but every word was aimed at me. And I think maybe it's a chance." She asked, "A chance for what?" Michael replied, "A chance to show them that truth doesn't live in slogans, but in actions. And if I'm wrong, then it's time to make it right." That night, Michael didn't sleep. He sat by the window in his office, staring toward the airport, where the signal lights blinked without pause. He thought of William, of the cold eyes, the razor-sharp voice, of the platinum-haired young man caught in confusion between two paths. Then he thought of himself, once believing that justice only needed to be right to prevail. But now he understood, justice also requires listening. The next morning, he asked the communications team to prepare an open letter addressed to local activist groups. The message was an invitation to a public dialogue at the city's convention center. No security, no spin, just data, real stories, and answers directly from the leadership team. At that moment, Alex entered with a sharp glint in her eyes. "We've identified two SEF members preparing banners, projectors, and planning to assemble at the Central Square on Wednesday morning." Michael nodded. "They want a loud debut. We'll wait for them there. But not to argue, to invite them in." Alex raised an eyebrow. "You'll stand there and wait," Michael replied. "I'll stand at the door and open it for anyone who wants to talk. Because this airline isn't afraid of truth. What I fear is silence. And I'm done being silent." Wednesday morning, the city's Central Square was awash in the muted sunlight of early autumn. The air was still, the breeze barely enough to stir the flags outside SkyReach headquarters. Plainclothes security personnel stood scattered among the crowd, radio earpieces hidden under jackets. A soft barrier made of guide ropes was set up about 30 paces from the main doors, not to block, but to direct. There were no police, no tactical vehicles, just a few news vans and a handful of microphones already set beneath the stage SF was assembling in front of the building. Michael appeared at 8:10 a.m., not from the main entrance as usual, but from a side exit used by the logistics team. He wore a white shirt, no blazer, no symbols of power. Beside him stood Mary in a flight attendant uniform with no name tag. Alex followed behind, no dark sunglasses, no words. They stood beneath the overhang of the ground floor, where sunlight had not yet reached, waiting as the crowd began to form. Groups arrived gradually. Some carried signs and slogans, others simply stood, observing. Flyers with Michael's image and clipped, provocative headlines began circulating. One showed him shaking hands with corporate leaders, the bold caption reading, "Can profit be humanitarian?" A group of students read aloud from old internal reports, outdated statistics framed as undeniable proof. William arrived at 8:30, still in his worn leather jacket, his face cold, eyes probing. The young man beside him, they had cut his hair shorter, wore a gray hoodie, his gaze flickering between resolve and hesitation. William raised his hand. A wireless mic was handed to him. He began with a burst of dramatic rhetoric. SkyReach is just one of hundreds of companies hiding behind a facade of charity, masking their exploitation of cheap labor, excluding minorities from hiring pipelines, painting a picture of justice with a few token scholarships. The crowd clapped. Some whistled in support. William's voice grew louder and firmer. "And today here we will tear down that illusion. We're not here to negotiate. We're here to tell the world. Justice is not a brand. It's action." When he paused, Michael stepped out from the shadow, slowly, without a mic, no assistant, no entourage. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cameras turned toward him. William flinched but quickly regained composure. Michael stood at the center of the square, his gaze calm, not angry, not defiant. He said, "I've heard you. Now it's my turn." A mic was passed to him. He held it, voice steady and clear. "You say I wear a mask. I stand here with nothing hidden. I'm the man who heard William speak about this plan from the seat in front of him on a flight 3 days ago. And I know you don't just doubt me, you're angry, and maybe anger is justified." The square fell silent. William stepped back. The young man lowered his head. Michael continued, "You're not wrong to demand transparency, but you are wrong if you think the best way to get it is to destroy what people are trying to build. We've made mistakes. There are systems that need fixing. But instead of breaking down the door, knock. Instead of condemning with posters, speak up with questions. And I'm here to answer all of them." Cameras flashed nonstop. A female student in front raised her hand. She said, "I applied to your company twice, got rejected both times, and I don't know why. I'm from a poor district. I want to know, was it my address that got me filtered out?" Michael nodded, asked her name, then said, "I'll look into it with HR, 2D. If there was injustice, I apologize. If not, I'll explain why. But you deserve an answer." A middle-aged man shouted, "You only hire people with connections. Locals get pushed out." Michael didn't argue. He said, "Then come into the hall after this. I have the data. If you're right, we fix it. If you're wrong, I hope you'll acknowledge it." William stepped forward again, seized the mic. His voice still rang out, but it was hoarser this time. He said, "You're too smooth. You're not apologizing. You're just justifying." Michael looked him in the eye. "I'm not justifying, I'm responding. If you have data, present it. If you have victims, bring them in. We have chairs ready, spreadsheets ready, department heads ready. But I don't do slogan shouting and walk away." William gripped the mic tightly. He looked around and saw hesitation in the eyes of some. A few lowered their signs. Others simply listened. He turned to the young man, handed him the mic as if passing on a verdict. The young man took it. His voice shook but was clear. "I used to believe everything he said. I thought I was fighting for justice. But that day on the plane, I heard you, the CEO, say nothing. You just listened. I saw you weren't afraid. I started to doubt. I thought, if someone's willing to stand in front of a crowd like this, then at the very least he deserves a conversation." Scattered applause broke out. Michael nodded. "I won't promise I'm always right, but I promise I won't hide. Starting tomorrow, all hiring data will be published. We'll bring in independent auditors, and you, if you want, can be part of the oversight." A woman stepped forward, eyes glistening. She reached out her hand. Michael held it, then turned to William. William, he said, "I don't hate you. I only regret that you chose to tear down instead of build. But if today you want to step in, the round table still has a seat for you, Mo." William said nothing. He tossed the mic onto a chair, turned away. No words, no backward glance. Some followed him. Others stayed. Many began walking toward the building. Michael led the way, hands empty, heart unafraid. The glass doors opened. Sunlight streamed into the lobby, where the real dialogue was only just beginning. And he stepped in, no longer a CEO behind a desk, but a man ready to answer, before everyone, every question, with the truth in hand. The glass doors of SkyReach headquarters closed behind Will Kane, the man who chose to walk away instead of taking a seat. But behind him, another crowd remained. They no longer held signs. They held questions. They held hope. And they stepped forward, seeking answers. Michael stood in the center of the grand lobby, no longer the anonymous figure from that flight, no longer the man quietly listening to a rebel's whispered plan. Now he was the one who spoke, the one who stood his ground, the one who upheld the value he believed in. Justice is not elegant language on a website. It is daily action, a commitment to correct what's wrong, and the courage to sit in the middle of outrage and listen. This story didn't end with cheers or triumph. It ended with an open door, with light pouring in, with quiet handshakes. Perhaps not everyone believed him yet, but they had begun to ask questions instead of raising slogans. And that is the beginning of lasting change. Michael would keep flying, keep listening, keep walking those anonymous aisles with his cap pulled low, not to hide, but to understand. Because as an undercover CEO, he knew well, no one can change the whole world, but anyone can begin with one flight, one conversation, and one promise kept to the very end.